Hello and welcome back to the SanteSuite community channel. It's been a while since we've released new content, and I apologize for that. We've been very busy working on packaging and new features for the core CDR, as well as some of the solutions in SanteSuite, particularly the SanteMPI solution. We've been working on a lot of content for that, and I'm going to be super excited to show you all of that in the coming months. This video is actually the first in our Quick Bits series. And in our Quick Bits series, what we're going to do is we're going to actually do some hands-on exercises with the new packaging and some of the new features in SanteMPI in particular, but also touching on the SDK as well as some of the new web access gateway features. In this video, we're going to go over how to install and configure SanteMPI on a Windows virtual or physical operating system environment. We're going to set up the core MPI and configure it. We're going to set up the web access gateway with the administrative panel. Then we're going to run some installation qualification testing to make sure that our setup is working correctly. And I'll show you some of the messages that are flowing back and forth for that. And then finally, we're going to log into the user interface and just validate that everything is working appropriately for SanteMPI. So without further ado, let's get to it. All right, so to start with, I've got an empty virtual operating system environment here running Windows. We're using Windows 10, and I've gone ahead and I've installed SoapUI and PostgreSQL. And these are prerequisites if you are running, PostgreSQL is a prerequisite if you're running SanteDB Server on Windows and you're going to use the Windows installer. And SoapUI is required to run the installation qualification tools, or rather installation qualification tests. So on the downloads page for SanteDB on the wiki, we have here our download links, and you'll see here that we have the iCDR and MPI iCDR. And you can see they use the same installation instructions, and that's because the MPI is really just the iCDR with the MPI modules enabled. So the installation procedure is nearly identical. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on this, and I'm going to download the latest version of the MPI, SanteMPI installer. And if you're using Microsoft Edge, you might have to tell it that it's safe to download this file because the file name keeps changing for each version. Smart Screen just doesn't think that it's downloaded very often. So I'm just going to select keep anyway. And we will open this file, and you'll see once again that we've got a published or signed installer, and it's just Smart Screen isn't recognizing the installer. So I'm going to hit run anyways. And so now this is just a standard Windows installation procedure. I'm going to hit I accept the agreement. And I'm just going to select the default directory. And you'll see here there's a whole bunch of different options which we can select. And the reason we have these different options in SanteDB is that you can actually specialize different application servers to perform different roles in a logical deployment of SanteDB, so a cluster of SanteDB. So for example, you might have one node only doing HL7 Fire. You might have another node doing HL7 version 2, etc. And you'd want to disable different plugins based on where this particular server is fitting within your SanteDB deployment. But for our quick bits, we're just going to hit the next button, and we're going to let the installer go ahead and set up the prerequisites, as well as copy over our files and register our services. And I will join you when it's done. All right, we're done our installation here, and the next thing I'm going to do is hit configure SanteDB Server. And what this is going to do is it's going to launch the configuration tool. And now in previous versions of SanteDB, before the configuration tool is ready, you would have to manually create a configuration file from scratch, which was quite tedious. So what we've done with SanteDB and SanteMPI is we've actually implemented the configuration tooling. And the first thing I'm going to do is set an initial configuration. And this is going to allow the configuration tool to kind of seed the configuration environment that we're using. So I'm going to select a database provider that I'm going to be using for this deployment. We're going to use easy configuration because it's a little bit faster. So I'm just going to press PostgreSQL here, and I'm going to type in my PostgreSQL server, and we're going to put in our user. In this dev environment, it's just Postgre. And when I select the dropdown, you'll see in an empty PostgreSQL database, there's no specialized place to put SanteDB. So I'm actually going to create a new database connection, and I'm going to call it SanteMPI, and I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm just going to set some database pooling options. So for example, we're going to talk here, yes, we want pooling. Our minimum pool size is 5, and our maximum pool size is 10. And this is just standard PostgreSQL configuration settings. The instance name here is actually if you're going to run or install multiple copies of SanteDB in different roles or for different services, you would be able to change the instance name, and this is going to modify the Windows service name that is used when we deploy SanteDB. And I'm just going to I'm going to set the template to SanteMPI Server. The template is really there to allow you to choose which modules that you would want automatically enabled and registered. And the SanteMPI Server option actually has all the FHIR services for MPI and all the HL7 version 2 services for MPI already pre-configured for us. So I'm just going to hit the continue button, and it takes a little while to load up the configuration here, but eventually we're going to get a list of tasks. And the list of tasks here are telling us exactly what the configuration tool is going to do to our configuration file. And you can imagine in a production environment, it's actually quite helpful to understand what it is that is being changed on the server and what it is that's being done to the configuration file. And I can actually just disable any one of these configuration tasks by selecting the check mark and deactivating that configuration step. So I'm going to press OK here, and we're going to load our configuration up. And what we have now is we actually have a copy of SanteDB installed. And if I run my services application, and I go down to SanteDB host process, you can see there's an actual service waiting there to be started. But first, what I want to do is typically I would want to configure SanteDB, and in this case SanteMPI for my jurisdiction. So what we've done in the configuration tool is there are a series of groups or logical groupings for different sets of functionality. So here I can see that this particular instance of SanteMPI is going to be using the ATNA dispatcher and sending it DICOM audits over UDP to localhost. I might want to disable that feature because I don't use DICOM audits, and I might actually want to come in and maybe enable the FHIR audits. And I actually have SoapUI running, so I'm just going to set the endpoint to my FHIR server and set the different authentication parameters for my audits. We're going to have a video that goes through all of these configuration options and covers the configuration tool in more depth. This is just a quick bits video, so the only thing that I'm going to change for our little quick bits tutorial is the logging and tracing level. And by default, the server is going to log everything, and that's really dense logs. So what we want to do is just change that down to informational for our demonstration. When I'm satisfied with a particular configuration panel, I can just press Apply Changes. And when I press Apply Changes, you can see that there's, again, a list of tasks that are going to be done on this particular server. I'm just going to press OK. And if I go back to my Windows Service Manager, you'll see now that SanteDB is actually starting. Now, on the initial run of a SanteDB startup, and it doesn't matter if it's in Docker or Linux or Windows, the very first run of a SanteDB server startup is the initialization of the database and importing all of the data sets and code systems and place registrations. So the very first startup can actually take 5 or 10 minutes, again, depending on the database connection speed, depending on the server speed, etc. So it's just good to let it go ahead and start up. And while that's starting up, what I'm going to do is go back over to my releases page. And like I said before, we were going to install the Web Access Gateway as well. So let's go ahead and download that while we're waiting. So once again, I'm just going to download the most recent version. I'm going to tell Windows to keep it. And I'm just going to check quickly back on my SanteDB instance. And here you'll see we now have a running SanteDB host process. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up the installer for the Web Access Gateway. And once again, you'll see that this is another standard Windows installer experience. Now, the Web Access Gateway is a little bit easier to install. There's no real options for it. But basically what we're doing now is we are actually setting up the portal host or the gateway that's going to be serving out our user interface. And in this case, it's going to be our administrative user interface. Now in production, you'd probably install this on a separate server, but just for this demonstration, we're going to install it on the same server. When I'm done installation, it's going to ask me to configure the web portal, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And what we're going to be presented with here is the domain joining screen. So like we had mentioned before, the DCDRs, the disconnected gateway, the Android app, the Windows app, and even the Web Access Gateway, those are clients to the iCDR. And what this screen is doing is it's actually asking us to join that security domain or join the iCDR security route. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to use localhost as my domain. If you were running this on a separate machine, you would turn this from localhost to the host name of the iCDR that you're installing. You can also change the device identifier if you'd like, and also the port number. And if you're using TLS to connect between the Web Access Gateway and the iCDR, which you would do if you are accessing the iCDR from outside of a data center, you would enable the SSL TLS layer. But we're not doing that. What we're doing is we're joining on localhost, so it's unsecured. If you're running SanteDB in a production environment, we usually recommend doing SSL termination at an Nginx or an IIS server, and then having the Web Application Gateway talk to your iCDR without encryption, because that just helps with the overhead of SSL. Okay, so after I've validated my connection settings, I'm just going to hit Join Domain. And I'm going to be prompted to log in to the iCDR security domain. So I'm just going to go ahead and type in the username and password, and I'm just using the default administrator and Mohawk123. And we're just going to go ahead and log in. And get a warning that I've already been registered, but that's okay. And then here we go, we have welcome to the domain. And what's happened here is the system has actually been registered or onboarded into the iCDR instance. So I'm just going to press OK. Next, one SanteDB iCDR server can fill many roles, especially if you're using it as a generic CDR and you have different user interfaces that you want to expose. And this is really where you're going to tell the Web Access Gateway what role this particular user interface is going to play in the iCDR context. And you can see here I've got the generic administration portal, but I also have the MPI plugin. So I'm going to set my role to be an MPI access gateway, or rather an MPI user interface. And important, make sure you check automatically update applets, because if you don't, then the Web Access Gateway will never actually download the applet selection that you've made. This is more for custom installer screens. You can pre-bundle the installer or the Android app, and you might not want to have updates automatically applied if you've already pre-bundled your user interface in like an APK or your custom Windows installer. I'm going to hit next. And next we're going to set up the synchronization mode, and because we're using the Web Access Gateway, it doesn't support SQLite, so we have to set online only. If you use the disconnected mode, the service won't start up because there is no database software installed with the Web Access Gateway, so there won't be any way for the synchronization to even work. So I'm going to hit next, and then we're going to set our log level. When I set the log level in the configuration tool here, this is the log level of the iCDR service. This, in this user interface, is the log level of the DCDR Web Access Gateway. And there are two separate sets of logs, one for just the iCDR, where everybody's connecting to the APIs and the authentication happens, as well as the logging of the DCDR Web Access Gateway. So I'm just going to keep it at errors and warnings and click next. Application services are primarily used by the disconnected gateway service. If you're running the disconnected gateway, you may want to enable, for example, syslog endpoints, or you might want to enable FHIR endpoints or HL7 endpoints. And this is where you would enable those services. But because we're doing a Web Access Gateway, we can just ignore this setting and just hit next. And next we're going to have an optimization method between the DCDR and the iCDR. And what you're going to do here is you're going to tell the DCDR or the Web Access Gateway what kind of connection exists between your Web Access Gateway and your iCDR instance. So fast is using gzip compression. Very fast is using deflate compression. And really, unless you have like a really slow network, for the Web Access Gateway, we recommend using a local network option, unless you're like on some 100 megabit or very slow or high latency network. Then you might want to compress the data between your Web Access Gateway and your iCDR. But since we're just on localhost, using local network is more than sufficient. That won't do any compression, and we won't waste any CPU cycles. And finally, we're going to set other settings. Now, the other settings allow us as a deployer of the Web Access Gateway to customize how the SanteDB and SanteMPI core user interfaces behave. So if I go over to my Releases tab here and I click on Installing the Web Access Gateway, and I click on the other settings topic, I'll see here that there's a list of user interface settings. And what these allow us to do is to set fields as optional or required. We can also hide fields as well. So for example, if I wanted to say capture patient religion, which is a field that's hidden and not captured by default, I might go in and just say, on this instance, I'm going to say, yes, I want to capture patient religion. Now, most field applications, so for example, the Myanmar MPI has a custom setup screen, which automatically sets all of these based on the Myanmar context. But because this is the vanilla MPI, we are going to leave these as, we have to customize them in a user interface. But again, if you were actually rolling out a nation scale application, you would probably write your own custom setup logic, which includes the default application settings already. And I'm just going to press finish. And if I go over to my services here, what you'll see is we actually set up another service or another, it's like a Windows daemon that is for the web access gateway, the web portal. And if I just refresh this here, I'll see that it is now running, it's restarted. And if I go back to my user interface, we can see now we have the login screen. So I'm going to log in with, again, the username and password, the default username and password. And this is my dashboard for my empty MPI instance. And for my empty MPI instance, what I want to do is take a look at the user interface here. So I can see I've got options for system management. So for example, if I wanted to look at the probes, I would get diagnostic information about the host machine that's running either the web access gateway or the central iCDR instance. And this is just a way that we can monitor the health of the server. And we've got lots of other options like a dispatch queue, and we can look at the server status and find out the versions of the software that we're running. So this is really, the system menu is for administrators to understand the current status of the system. We have the Security Center. Security Center, as you can imagine, is where the audit repository lives. We can manage groups and users and devices. And we will be covering these in more detail in future videos. But for now, the Security Center is where you will do any tuning of the MPI related to security. Our reference data, we have different identity domains we can set, and different policies on those identity domains. And this is really where all the reference data lives in the iCDR. And then finally, we have the MPI. And you'll notice here that the MPI gives me an access denied. And the reason that it gives me an access denied is that we have an administrator account here. And by default, SanteDB does not permit system administrators to view or manipulate clinical data. That's not permitted. So what we need to do is we actually need to go in and give our administrator group permission to see this functionality. So to do that, we're going to click on the security group, and we're going to click on groups, and we're going to go to our administrators group, and we're going to add some policies to our administrator group. So the policies we're looking for is related to clinical data. And you can see here there's different policies for reading, writing, but there's also unrestricted. And you'll see that there's these big numbers, these OIDs after each policy. And the way that these work is that you can see here unrestricted clinical data ends in 922 and write clinical data ends in 9221. So that means that giving unrestricted clinical data implies write clinical data is also granted. And I can see here that we have now our grant on unrestricted clinical data. And then I'm also going to add, because we are an MPI, I'm going to add MDM. And again, I want to add all MDM policies to this user group. So now I've got unrestricted clinical data, and I've got unrestricted master data management. Now, if I click on SanteMPI again, you'll see the access is still denied. And the reason is that my permission set is assigned to the session that I have, not the user account. So right now I'm in a current session. So what I need to do is actually log out of my session and then log back into my session. And now you'll see that we have a recent patients tab, and on the MPI we can now have the dashboard, of course, with 0 patients. So how are we going to test that our MPI is actually set up properly and that it's functioning as we expect it to function? And the answer to that is we're going to run the installation qualification tooling. So I go back to my help on the wiki, and I scroll down to my installation documentation. I'll see here that we have the iCDR server, and there's a section called installation qualification. And what we were particularly interested in, just for this particular demonstration, is the fire test cases. And the fire test cases are represented as a SoapUI project. And that's why I had downloaded SoapUI. And what I'll need to do is actually grab a copy of the test cases in SoapUI format. So I'm going to click on the SanteMPI GitHub, and you'll see here I've got the test cases SoapUI project. And I'm just going to go ahead and download this, and we're going to save it in my downloads folder just as an XML document. Next, what I want to do is I want to actually open up SoapUI. So we're going to go SoapUI here. And SoapUI is a tool that lets us not only send messages out to the SanteMPI system to test that it's working, but it also has a receiver that can receive messages from our MPI, which we can use to test that the publish and subscribe functionality is working properly. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on import, and I'm going to go to my downloads. I'm going to import my SoapUI project into my SoapUI workspace. And you can see here that there's a series of REST definitions taken, and these are adapted from the Swagger documentation that is emitted by SanteDB. And we've actually gone through and we've restricted them down to only those which are used for MPI. And then we have here a Fire mock service. So I'm just going to start this mock service, and I'm going to allow it to access firewall here. And now what's happening is SoapUI is actually listening for events. And I can see here that I have different audit events from my MPI. And that's because I had, if you remember, done the audit configuration with the configuration tool. So I just went back and refreshed the page, and you can see that SoapUI is receiving audits from the MPI. And then what we want to do is we actually want to open up our installation qualification. And the installation qualification test suite is a series of test cases, which are, if I go to the wiki here, back to my wiki, I can see that they are actually documented here in the wiki as to what is it that the test is actually testing for, and why is this test required. So I can see here OHIDCR 01, and I see here OHIE CR01. Now, you can just run these as a test of the entire MPI. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to change one of these subscription endpoints. And the reason we do this is, if I pull up a message here, we can see that the default test cases are actually configured to use Docker. We don't want to use Docker because we're on Windows, so I'm going to change the Docker specific host to just localhost. And I'm going to change each of the subscribe messages to just send to localhost to ensure that I'm not sending these messages off into space. And after modifying that setting, I can go ahead and run my installation qualification testing tool. And what we're going to see is that the test cases are going to run. And what you should see is you should see an indication that all tests are successful. And you'll see down here as the tests are going, we're producing audit events. And then after the subscription test is run here, you'll see that we're actually broadcasting out patient events. And that's because these tests are creating subscriptions for our messages. If I go back to my user interface here, the MPI Master Patient Index dashboard, you'll see here, now I've got some data. And we'll go through in a later video what these screens mean. But we can actually just open up a patient here and take a look that we have a properly set up MPI environment. And you can see here that I've got entity relationships for Dr. Flynn full profile. And we can actually see what data is inside of the MPI with our administrative panel. So there you have it. We took a Windows VM and we installed SanteMPI as an iCDR with FHIR and HL7 messages enabled. Then we installed the Web Access Gateway so we could see what data was inside of our MPI. And then we also ran the installation qualification tooling to validate that our MPI was set up appropriately and that we were actually able to send and receive FHIR messages to and from it. Of course, this is just for demonstration environment, and this is where the asterisk comes out. You probably wouldn't want to use this in a production environment. Well, you would want to use SanteMPI in a production environment, but you wouldn't want to set it up this way in a production environment. You'd probably have more than one operating system environment, so more than one virtual machine or more than one physical machine hosting your SanteDB infrastructure. You probably also wouldn't give administrators access, or rather unlimited access, to clinical data. And you might also want to fine-tune your configuration for matching, as well as changing the security settings from the default security settings. The environment we set up has all the default community secrets for signing data and sessions. And also it has absolutely no transport layer security, which again, you would probably want to enable. All of that is documented on our wiki, how to use the configuration tool and use Nginx to set up reverse proxies and also bind certificates to API endpoints. And also some of the other work you would go into doing for MPI for production is also coming out on our wiki. We update it very regularly with new implementation guidance and templates for things like policies and planning your identity domains, etc. But of course, that's outside the scope of this video. Next week, we're going to be doing this exact same exercise, but we're going to be doing it on Docker containers. So we're going to set up a SanteMPI with a Web Access Gateway on a Docker container. You can imagine that Docker, we don't have access to the configuration tooling, so we have to use environment variables. And we'll explore how that's a little bit different to configure your Docker instance. And then the video after that, we will look at how to do this exact same setup on Linux. So we're going to be using Ubuntu, and we're going to set up the exact same infrastructure on Ubuntu. Finally, if you do need additional help, you can always reach out to us at info@SanteSuite.com. We do provide community-based support, and we'd love to hear what your project is and how you plan on using SanteDB. Because you can imagine there's a lot of different configuration options and moving parts, and each one will be different depending on the context and the use of SanteDB that you're planning to use. And we can help you navigate that, of course. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you for tuning in. It's been a long video. I promise that our quick bits next time will be a little bit more quick. The Windows installation, I tried to cover a lot of the fundamental concepts of the administrative gateway. And our Docker deployment will be a little bit simpler. So finally, thank you again for watching. I'm Justin Fife, and I'll see you next time.